Well, thank you guys for being here. We're excited to share a little more about the work. We've been working on this project. We were talking about it earlier. We started early 2023, and it's kind of taken on. Oh, sorry. I'm soft-spoken. We started working on this in 2023, and it's kind of taken on a life of its own since then. It's showed in Texas and at the Poetry Foundation. And so we're really honored to bring it to Oregon and share it with you guys and share these stories with you. So I thought I'd give a little bit of context on how the project came about and a little bit about the Escaramuza tradition and why it's relevant in today's landscape. And then I'll hand it off to Angelina for a reading. My connection with Escaramuza really began through my own bond with horses. I've been a competitor in Western lifestyle riding for the past 15 years, and I moved to Texas from my native Switzerland to essentially to be a cowgirl. And photography became a way for me to explore this connection with horses that I had in a deeper way. And it's really a fascination that has shaped much of my life. And so I'm drawn to these relationships that I know intimately, particularly between women and horses. When I first came across Escaramuza, it was hard not to fall in love. I think we can all appreciate the beauty and the elegance of these riders. So these are all-female precision riding teams of 8. And they perform high-speed maneuvers to music, and they're riding side saddle in these beautiful handcrafted dresses. So they're fierce, they're proud, and they're captivating. But as I started really researching the tradition, I discovered its deeper historical roots, which felt, again, really relevant to the story and something that I really wanted to focus on. So Escaramuza is just one of the events that makes up charrería, which charrería, for those of you who aren't familiar, is often described as the Mexican version of rodeo. In reality, it's a predecessor to North American rodeo. It started back in the 16th century when the Spaniards introduced horses to Mexico. And it's since developed, much like rodeo in North America, it's developed to encompass a range of events that showcase the equestrian and livestock skills of charros, or horsemen. And historically, women were completely excluded from charrería, so they weren't allowed to ride horseback alongside the men. It wasn't until the 1950s that women really started requesting a place in charrería. Charrería was declared the national sport of Mexico at some point, and it still is. So it's very important to the culture. And so, yeah, in the 1950s, this tradition of Escaramuza was created, and like many traditions, there is a legend behind it. So the inspiration behind the creation has to do with the soldaderas, the women who fought during the Mexican Revolution between 1910 and 1920. And the Adelita dress and the music that they're performing to, all of that comes from the evolution of the image of the soldadera. The history of women's participation in the Mexican Revolution is quite complex, and the image of the soldadera has often been mythologized and beautified and sexualized in pop culture. And one of the well-known stories that we tend to hear is that the soldaderas were sent into battle prior to the male soldiers to kick up dust and create distraction and create the illusion that there were more soldiers than there really were before the men were sent into battle. In reality, that the women's role in the Mexican Revolution is much more complex than that, but this myth persists within the contemporary escaramuza tradition, and that was something that I sought to reference in the photographs. But ultimately, it's really the stories of the escaramuzas that I met that became the driving force behind the project. Early on, when I was researching the tradition, I decided to focus on US-based escaramuzas rather than traveling to Mexico and photographing the tradition there. This project was actually initially commissioned by the Cowgirl Museum, who wanted to do an exhibit on the tradition, and it would be natural to think, well, I should photograph it in Mexico. But once I started speaking to people that were practicing in the US, I realized that the US-based story was really where I wanted to focus. And so I traveled across the US photographing and interviewing escaramuza teams. So a lot of the images that you see on the walls are from different states. I did photograph a few teams in Oregon. There's some teams from Illinois, quite a few from Texas, California, and so on. And these conversations that I had with these women were really they deeply influenced how I chose to photograph them. Many of the women that I met are full-time students, or they work full-time, or work multiple jobs, and they're also raising families. And that was one of the key differences between how, in my research, again, because I haven't been to Mexico, but for this project, but in Mexico, there's a lot of resources around charrería culture, a lot of wealth, and the families that I was meeting in the US, they are often first, second, third, fourth generation Mexican American, and one of the stories that I kept hearing is that when their parents immigrated or grandparents, they didn't have many means, and they had to build their way up to being able to afford this sport, because owning horses is expensive, the dresses are expensive, transportation, all of that. So it's a true cost. And the women that I met had, they were pouring a lot of resources into being able to pursue their passion. It's also very time consuming, all the practicing and so on and so forth. And then furthermore, through a lot of these conversations that we were having, there were all these narratives around immigration and identity that emerged that I felt like were very important to highlight. Many of the writers had talked about this feeling of not feeling Mexican enough when they go back to Mexico and visit their extended families, but then also not feeling American enough at home, and somehow this sport being something that gives them a sense of belonging. And then gender dynamics were another interesting theme, or reoccurring theme. So I mentioned earlier that there's this history of women not being included in the sport of charrería, and there still very much is a discrepancy in representation. So a charreada, which is the term for rodeo, would last about 3 hours, and the portion dedicated to women is about maybe 5 minutes. And it still isn't, there's a governing association for charreada, and the governing association at this point, I believe, still doesn't allow women to participate in the other disciplines. So Escaramuza is the one place that they've carved out for themselves, essentially. And then there's other things that kind of relate to this too. The fact that There's some very strict dress codes as to how the women have to present themselves in competition, which is not the case for the male charros. So there was a lot of sort of these conversations that I was having. I realized that there was some frustration around some of these things, but then also a lot of reverence for tradition, and you know, it felt very important to most of the women to preserve these traditions, even if at times they felt like they were restrictive. So that was something that I wanted to show in the images too, is this sense of strength and dedication, and respect for the tradition alongside sort of a quiet sense of defiance. And then as far as kind of conceiving the body of work, it became obvious early on as I was speaking to these women and started photographing them and making these portraits. I had sort of a strong idea of how I wanted to photograph them, but it felt important. I felt like I needed to bring in another medium, that telling their story would require more than photography. So that's really where the poetry came in. So I recorded hours and hours of conversations with the teams around the country, and then worked with Angelina and Ire'ne, who's not here today, but passed the audio over to them as well as the images, and they worked to bring their voices to life, essentially. And you'll see as you read the poetry on the walls that you know, some of these powerful themes are emerging around identity and legacy and culture, family and femininity, and also resistance. And so, yeah, in a world where women's narratives have often been overlooked or overshadowed, I think the words of Ire'ne and Angelina add a lot of depth, immersion, and resonance to the stories that we're telling here. And they're stories of resilience and courage and empowerment, and I think stories that transcend borders and speak to the universal experiences of women everywhere. So I'll pass it on to Angelina.
Voila. Hello. You know, it's interesting to be in Portland, interesting to be in this country right now. And I want to open with a quote from Edward Said, because this is, you know, a room with photographs and poems, but in the context and the challenges and the persecution of the people that these escaramuza belong to, it's important that this work is here right now, representing a culture and a community that is being persecuted. So this is a quote from Edward Said's Culture and Imperialism. "No one today is purely one thing. Labels like Indian or woman or Muslim or immigrant or American are not more than starting points, which, if followed into actual experience for only a moment, are quickly left behind. Imperialism consolidated the mixture of cultures and identities on a global scale, but its worst and most paradoxical gift was to allow people to believe that they were only mainly exclusively white or black or Western or Oriental. Yet, just as human beings make their own history, they also make their cultures and ethnic identities. No one can deny the persisting continuities of long traditions, sustained habitations, national languages, and cultural geographies. But there seems no reason except fear and prejudice to keep insisting on their separation and distinctiveness, as if that was all human life was about. Survival, in fact, is about the connections between things. In Eliot's phrase, reality cannot be deprived of the other echoes that inhabit the garden. It is more rewarding and more difficult to think concretely and sympathetically, contrapunctually about others than only about us. But this also means not trying to rule others, not trying to classify them or put them in hierarchies. Above all, not constantly reiterating how our culture or country is number one. So with that, we have 3 buttons on the table of the exhibit. I am wearing one, and it says, "Culture Lasts." So, I'll just start with reading, and it is on the wall. "I will die as a charra. On earth, we have material things, but you can't take any of that with you when you die. You have to decide what is going to last. What will you pass on? What will you hold on to forever? Culture lasts. Escaramuza is culture. There is a saying, you are not born a charra, but you can be made into one. And when you leave this earth, you will leave as a charra. My grandfather was buried as a charro. I am going to write in my will that I also need to be buried in my traje de gala. Charrería is what I will take with me and what I will leave behind." You can thank us later. Brother Charro, do you realize that it is because of Escaramuza that you have an audience? Our performances are the most anticipated part of the show. If it was just the men, you'd have 3 people in the stands. It is true, we get 8 minutes and you get 8 hours. But trust me, the kids, parents, brothers, and sisters in the stands come especially for those 8 minutes. Where else can you see such elegant sportsmanship? So as Constance mentioned, Ire'ne and I listened to more than 30 hours of interviews that she did with the Escaramuza teams and read dozens of historical articles about the history of Escaramuza, the historical context, and one of the things that was the most striking as Constance mentioned, was even today in 2025, 2026, how women are excluded from participating in decisions around charrería. So all of the poems really, I can tell you part of my process was to listen to the interviews, read the articles, and then take notes. I'm doing my PhD right now, so thematic analysis, coding, but really like what is repeated over and over. And I wrote 15 poems, and the 15 poems represent what was repeated over and over again in these interviews. And this topic of feeling voiceless, every single team talked about it. whose interview that I listened to. So this is, I try to read the poems that are on the walls, but this is one of them. You are prettier when you are quiet. I am a feminist who loves my sport, and the machismo in charrería often gets to me. To be clear, I am not talking about my father, brothers, husband, or trainer, who respect, encourage, and support me. I am talking about the men who want me to keep my mouth shut. I am supposed to sit pretty and accept that I don't have a voice. I tell myself to get used to it like white noise in the background, and then something reminds me again of how women are second-class citizens in this sport, and I want to fight back. My dad tells me not to say anything. He does not want to give anyone the opportunity to disrespect me. The escaramuzas need to come together. If we combine the strength and unity of our teams, we will get the vote. I hope and pray that one day we will get past this and we will have a voice. So again, you know, as at the end, as you're looking at the images, there is such a depth to the lives of these athletes that I really hope you can appreciate. And that is beyond, you know, these gorgeous photographs. And one of the things that Constance mentioned is that these are mostly, if not all, working class athletes. There are no sponsors. So the horses, the trajes, their clothes, everything they pay for themselves. So this is a poem called "This is a Lifestyle, Not a Hobby." We are college students, are newly married, have children, have newborns, are homeowners and business owners. We pay for everything out of our own pocket. Many of us live paycheck to paycheck. We lend each other money. We put gas in each other's car. We share horses. We buy each other's sombreros. We replace each other's earrings. We give everything to Escaramuza. This is not what we do for leisure. This is our life. And I have two more. If you can, please go watch a video of an Escaramuza performance. Constance and I were saying earlier we can only watch scary movies at 10 a.m. So if you can't handle scary movies like us, watch it at 10 a.m. But it's surprising the speed at which they're riding and how close they ride past each other. So this is "We Talk with Our Eyes." My chestnut-colored horse gallops into the arena. I am side saddle, my wide-brimmed embroidered sombrero snug on my head. A high-neck green dress balloons over my petticoat and pantaloons. I am ready. Our team of 8 performs a precise, synchronized routine at full speed. Our horses turn inward from a wide circle and charge into the center. We closely pass each other. The slightest change in expression communicates if anything is wrong. We cross in front of and behind each other, then erupt into partner turns. Thundering back to the perimeter, our choreography is flawless. And this is my last one. Look at our boots and spurs. No, I don't dance horses. I am not a mariachi. I am not a baile folklorico dancer. I am not the halftime show or the intermission. I am not just a pretty woman sitting on a horse that is standing still. I am a charra with extraordinary riding skills. I am sitting side saddle, drenched in my own sweat, buried in a heavy layered dress, while I control 1,000 pounds of muscle beneath me. I am enacting a dangerous, mathematically precise routine at full velocity. I have fallen off of my horse, suffered concussions, broken bones, been dragged and trampled on. So the next time you see a woman dressed like me, look for the boots and spurs, and then you will know who I am. Thank you. Are there any questions?
I was wondering if you could speak a little more to the process of collaboration between the two of you, what that was like, and...
We have a friend in common. She wrote, so the coffee table book, Blue Sky is selling the coffee table book. And the introduction to the book was by Marcela Fuentes. Gosh, I'm totally blanking. Oh my God. And Constance wanted poetry to accompany the photographs. And Marcela gave her two names, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I reached out to, I didn't know any poets. I had no connections in the poetry world, but I had my mind set on poetry as a beautiful way to bring these women's words back into the project. And I got connected with Marcela through an old professor from my university, TCU in Fort Worth. And yeah, reached out to both. I got two names, reached out to both of them. They both said yes.
We happen to be best friends.
And
She didn't know that. And Marcela didn't know that, and she recommended both of us.
Yeah, so, and then as far as the collaboration, we didn't work together physically per se, because it really, I went on my photographic journey and kind of collected these interviews and conversations and did a lot of research on my end. And then it was a passing along, I think, and you can speak more to your process, but for me, I passed along the images and the conversations and the research that I'd done, which they then deepened on their end. And
yeah, I live in LA, and the other poet, Ire'ne, lives in San Antonio. So we just, very technical, we created a drive. Constance dropped a ton of files in there for us, and we went through everything and agreed on how many poems we were each gonna write. I wrote 15, Ire'ne wrote 15. And wrote the poems. And then...
And I think, that it's good to say that there was an understanding that photography is my craft and poetry is their craft, and that we were trusting each other to create what came out of, what we felt like we needed to create, so...
And I was even, when I was walking around, I've never noticed before, but my poems are vertical and Ire'ne's are horizontal. And I never noticed that until today. But, Ire'ne and I have very different styles. And she was most captivated by the articles, by the historical context. And I was just so absorbed in the current escaramuzas' voices. We didn't coordinate. We just, okay, we're gonna just come up with 15 and we'll check in whenever. And then when we checked in, I think I sent you mine first, and then Constance was like, oh, will there be poems about history? And then Ire'ne was like, all of mine are about the history. So it was like so harmonious. And
we got lucky.
We
really.
did, we really did.
Yeah, and I think having 3 very different perspectives ended up being really beautiful.
Yeah. And I have to say, so I grew up in downtown Los Angeles, urban. I've never actually been in person to an escaramuza. I just saw the videos online. So also for me, as an urban woman, it was so interesting to learn about the lives of these athletes and of horses, and it was so humbling, you know, because I thought, oh my God, I didn't know anything about this before Constance approached us to do this project. So it just reminded me, like, there's so many realities in the world. We don't know what everyone else is doing, right? But in other parts where we have no idea what's going on, really beautiful things are happening, you know, so, yeah.
Are you gonna go see one?
Hi. Yeah, I'm a full-time teacher and I'm doing my PhD and maybe in 2 years. When I graduate, I'm so busy, yeah. Yeah, any other questions?
A question for Constance. You talked about moving to Texas to become a cowgirl, and I'm curious what your style of writing is.
It's
you these kinds of costumes, or?
No, it's very much Western, so like North American rodeo style writing. So that's the world that I've been very familiar with and that I've been steeped in for the last 15 years. And Escaramuza is, interestingly, they have some Escaramuza demonstrations at the Fort Worth Stock Show and Rodeo every year. So that was kind of my first introduction to Escaramuza, and it's hard to look away because they're so beautiful. But I didn't really know much about the tradition. I didn't know much about the culture behind it until I was asked to work on this project by the Cowgirl Museum in Fort Worth, and that's kind of where the journey started. But yeah, the two are kind of, you know, charrería and North American rodeo are kind of adjacent to each other, and so when you're in one, you tend to run into the other, especially in Texas, where I'm in kind of the rural horse, you know, world there.
Do you have any advice on for navigating and also like contextualizing cross-cultural experiences, and how does because you two both have this, from you describe about the identity and the culture and how you and then how does there's assumed culture assigned to you by your skin colors, nationality, and how do you both of you conceptualize this and then and put it into art and navigate this while working on it?
You want me to go first?
Sure. I am a practicing Buddhist, and so the idea, you know, in Buddhism is that we're all the Buddha. That's our true identity, right? Which, for the sake of this reality, is we're all human beings. That's our true identity. And then, you know, for me personally, I just know that there's a universal. And thank goodness there is diversity in that universality. And so in my work, I am always trying to get to the essence of the humanity while celebrating the manifestation of that in terms of diversity. Yeah. So we have probably 85% more in common than that diversity, right? And then that really beautiful 15%. I teach kindergarten. I've been a kindergarten teacher for 25 years. And, you know, the kids are like, ill. And I'm like, we don't say ill. We say interesting. I don't know anything about that. And I'm not interested. Or tell me more, but we don't say ill. And so it's kind of, you know, like that, right? Like we can all have our things, but we also can respect and don't put down other people's things. Because, you know, somebody will come to school, you know, with whatever they're having, and a kid will be like ill, and that hurts their feelings. Like, why are you mad at them? That's their food, right? So along those lines, I don't know if that's helpful, but.
Yeah, your question made me think about when I first started working on this project. I think it would have been a lot harder for me to start engaging in making this work if I hadn't been commissioned for it. Because there is a lot of questioning around who has the right to tell someone else's story, rightly so at the moment. And when I was asked to do this project, I was very kind of aware of the fact that I'm white, privileged, you know, I have this background in horses, which thankfully was a connecting point. But, you know, there were questions around how do I navigate kind of discovering this community that essentially isn't mine and this tradition and culture that isn't mine. And I was, I remember early on going to the Houston Photo Fest portfolio reviews. It was during COVID. I had kind of started looking into this project, and they were still doing them online. And I remember having a review with a gallerist that basically told me that I should just not do this project. And you know, I tried to think of ways to do it that would be empathetic, and that I tried to be very aware of the fact that I'm telling someone else's story. And how do you go about doing that? And for me, it was about listening, and listening to the individual narratives, and then finding ways to create a body of work that, you know, I felt was empathetic and did all these stories justice. And you know, I hope that we achieved that. Yeah, that answers your question.
Question for both of you. As you dived into the interviews and the words, and as you looked at your subject, what's the one thing, perhaps a small element, that surprised you, that you didn't realize you would focus on, that you did, that was really important for you to share?
For me, really, it is how these women make this possible for themselves financially. There was a lot of talk of borrowing horses and basically doing everything themselves. Constance mentioned the teams in Mexico, and it appeared, I didn't go further into it, that usually people in Mexico, and you might know better than me, are people that have resources in Mexico. Poor Mexicans are not doing escaramuza.
Yeah, I think there's, I think that there's pockets,
Okay.
but there's just a much larger wealthy community that is doing it.
Yeah.
Right.
And so there was a kind of tension in the interviews of teams in the United States, or these women in the United States, saying, I do everything myself. And you don't. You have someone who saddles up your horse, you know, all brings them, you just show up and ride. We, from start to finish, do everything ourselves. And that was like, wow, really? So all of these pictures really, you know, their own money, they're doing it themselves, their family, sometimes it's often a family endeavor, but this is all them. It's very impressive.
Yeah, and I think for me, if I had to pick one kind of idea, I think it's the idea of belonging and all these conversations I had around I don't feel like I belong anywhere, which I think is something probably I mentioned earlier. This is a story that kind of transcends borders, and I think that could be a universal feeling, but it is very specific to this community as well, and so that's something that that I wanted to honor, and that in a way this tradition kind of, the way I've come to think of this tradition is that it's almost like a roadmap of belonging, essentially, for the women that participate in it, and hence the title as well, Poetics of Home. And so this is, I think, so much more than the competitive aspect and the skill. It's also about having a place to belong.
So I just have to say what the aura that I get from this is such a portrait with a combination of poetry and photographs of strength and pride. That is what this whole thing is. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you talk about some of the similarities and differences between the events in Texas and the events that you saw in Oregon? Because you talked about the differences between Mexico and Texas, but Texas and Oregon also very different.
Yeah, I think I meant to talk about Mexico and the U.S. because I think there's, in terms of the way the sport is practiced across the United States, I think the main difference is just that you have more. Texas has a bigger community that participates in charrería, so you've got more competitions to go to. So I guess more resources in that sense also, whereas the teams that I met in Oregon were limited in terms of the competitions that they could go to. They had to travel further, so it costs more money. And then there's also like a weather element. So Texas, the teams that I met in Texas and in California and Arizona, they can kind of practice year round. Whereas the teams I met in Oregon, Washington, Illinois, like there's a whole portion of the year where they can't ride their horses because the ground's frozen or, it's too wet or whatever. So I think, I think in terms of kind of the families that there's a lot of similarities across the states in the U.S., but it had more to do with access to competitions.
So the culture stayed the same.
Yeah.
And the style.
Yeah, very much so, I would say. Yeah.
I just want to say I'm glad you didn't listen to that reviewer. Project.
Me
It's
too.
really important to be interested in other people and tell their stories from your perspective as long as it's respectful.
Yeah.
But that whole concept to me is really distressing.
Yeah.
So thank you for not listening to them.
I think it was probably an important thing to hear at the beginning. I also like to be told that I can't do something because it gives me more. So I think it gave me like the push that I needed. But there's also value, I think, in what she was saying, that we do have to be careful about how we tell stories.
What's the result if we don't tell each other stories?
I
It's like we're not
agree.
interested in each other.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
the result.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about the women and their participation in directly telling their stories? Like, were they? I'm trying to figure out the way to ask this question. Like, how much did they participate in arranging themselves for the camera, or how much did you direct them? I'm curious if they were participants in that
Yeah, I tried very much, like, I went from the idea that the conversations, the interviews with, before I even knew that poetry was going to come into it, that the interviews would be a way for me to direct where the project would go. So the idea was to listen to what they were telling me and to go off of the way they were portraying themselves to me in the creation of the images. I think this is slightly overused as a term in photography nowadays, but I thought of it as a collaborative project, and that these women were participants in the creation of their portraits, and they, I went off of what they also wanted to reveal to me. But I also had, there's also subjectivity. I had an idea based on what I was hearing too, and I can't deny that as someone who's got my own feminist ideals, that's something that I wanted to bring out too. So there was some directing, and then there was also some kind of letting things happen.
So have they, I assume that they've seen photographs, and I'm just curious about the responses and what they felt about seeing themselves.
I was hoping that maybe, are there any escaramuzas in the audience?
No.
Okay. I was hoping that maybe folks, because it's the first time we've been in the Northwest, the exhibit. They came out overwhelmingly to the Poetry Foundation. We had this exhibit in Chicago. They drove from Atlanta. It was amazing. It was gorgeous, and they were in their full gear, as well as Fort Worth, and it's currently on exhibit in El Paso. And actually in April, one of the ranches that has an Escaramuza team is coordinating with the El Paso History Museum to do an Escaramuza day at their ranch. And it's going to be a day of programming. We'll be reading poetry. They're going to take the photographs over there. And so the Escaramuza that have been able to interact have just, have cried, and the husbands and the children and the fathers and the trainers are all there. It's been really powerful.
Yeah. And I would say too that one of my distinct memories from the first opening in Fort Worth was that I remember one of the Escaramuzas, Paula, seeing one of the poems, and I can't remember which poem it was now. I think you were prettier when you were quiet, and because that came directly from a conversation that I had with her and her sister about kind of navigating, these gender issues within the family, and the emotion that she had reading that poem on the wall. And so I think, overall it's been very positive experience for all of us involved. Chris, I think you...
Yeah, one of the things that I'm sort of hearing really clearly is this sort of struggle between wanting to upraise traditions and these things, and yet the traditions are often based in sexism and racism.
Right.
Modernity has something to offer here. And I'm really interested in how that issue seems like it's really front and center, particularly for the American ones who have to, they have to get their whole family to agree that this is how we're spending the family money. And I think that's a really interesting aspect of all this, and it's a question that I don't hear addressed very much in terms of like, how do you simultaneously honor tradition and yet not be
well, as a Chicana, there are a lot of things in my community that, come from centuries of colonialism, right, that we've internalized and act out. And so that's something that I have to live with, right, within my family. I live in East Los Angeles, in my neighborhood. these kinds of harmful behaviors are just something that we all have to negotiate. That's also universal, right? In each of our communities, we have things that are not helpful and are harmful. So it's a paradox, it's hard. It's like the Virgin of Guadalupe. We just had the Virgen de Guadalupe Day on December 12th, right? And everyone's fighting in the neighborhood like, she is from the colonizer. And then everyone's like, that's how we used her to, still practice our indigenous. So it's just all the constant things that we have to figure out post-colonialism or current colonialism or something.
So another question is about like the curatorial decision, like how do you decide to put like the image and the poem like in this like composition? Because your photography is on the poetic side of things, and then poetry is already the distilled language. So how do you decide like which is paired with what and the sequencing in between these, like how to balance them?
When we first started this together, the idea that I had in mind was to combine one image, like each image with a poem. I quickly started to feel like that was limiting to both mediums. Poetry and photography are very different mediums. One's very immediate, and I think poetry the way I live it is that I need to digest it. It's something I can read over and over again, and I'm always getting a new experience from it. And so I think in terms of like putting them together, the idea was to let each have their own space, and to not limit one with the other. So, and in terms of like this arrangement, every show that we've had has been arranged slightly differently. And I think the poems work well in many different arrangements with the images.
I'm always interested because the spaces are always different, the size. And so I'm always, every time I go into a space, I'm like, what pictures did they pick? And which poems did they pick? So there's some poems on the wall that I haven't seen anywhere else before that are really great, to see like, all right. So it's up to each space how they're coordinating that. Yeah, and it's always a surprise. And the poems are never, we could think like, oh, wherever they're at, that's the photograph that goes with them, but that's not true. It just happens to be the photograph that's next to it, but then it goes together, so it's interesting. Oh, we did.
Any more questions?
I have more of a technical question to you about maybe what was the medium, and also how long were you shooting these? And when you were doing it, did you have an assistant with you, a stylist with you? I think I'm a little bit more interested in the technical aspect of your process.
Yeah. No, it was very simple. It was just me and my camera. I was shooting a Contax 645 film camera, medium format film, color film. My background up until working on this project was mostly black and white film, and I was really new to color, so it took me a little while to figure it out. There was a bit of a learning curve, but yeah, so it was, it was a new way of working, but I tried to keep it as simple as possible, and there was no stylist involved. There was the women, typically when they practice, they're wearing regular attire. They only dress like this when they compete, but that was a decision on my behalf that I wanted to portray them in their kind of traditional attire, and honor kind of the formality behind the tradition. But they do their hair and makeup themselves before every competition, and that's exactly what they did for for the shoots. And then typically I would spend a couple days, especially if I was traveling far, I would spend a couple days with the team, and we would sit down for these interviews in between kind of photo sessions, and I would try to photograph them kind of several times over the course of a few days and really get to know them. Yeah.
Did you also photograph the actual sport, the actual activity, and you've chosen not to really include very much of that here.
Yeah.
I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I did. I went to some charreadas, mostly in Texas. I preferred kind of the quieter environment of them on their home turf, because a lot of times usually these lienzos, the arenas that they practice in, are owned by one of the team's families, or so I was going to their homes essentially and photographing them in their element, and it felt a lot more intimate. But in the book there is at least one image from a competition. Yeah.
On that note, the coffee table book is available for sale here on this table, as well as 2 of Angelina's books of poetry. And from what I understand, the coffee table book is a complete.
Yes.
Has all of the images and all of the poems.
It doesn't have all the images. It has a new selection of images. So a lot of the images that are in the book have not been seen in shows before. So it's a new selection, but then it has all the poems in both English and translated to Spanish as well.
And the artists are more than happy to sign them for you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you.